Hi, I'm Michael Andrade from Ground Zero, Minnesota. Welcome to Rethinking the World. Our topic today is spies and crime, and our guest is Mr. Gene Wheaton, retired criminal investigations officer for the Army, Air Force, and Marine Corps.
Correct.
Over a long career. You served in Korea and in Vietnam, and in Iran. I'd like you to elaborate a little bit on that for our audience that doesn't know you personally.
Well, I first served when I was very young in Korea in the Marine Corps. Came home, was a police officer in Tulsa, Oklahoma for a couple of years. And I was an OSI agent, Office of Special Investigations, criminal investigator and counterintelligence agent for the Air Force for 8-9 years. Served in Italy and in the States on that. And then made an inter-service transfer to the Army, and I was a special agent with the Army CID, the Criminal Investigation Division, until I retired from the Army.
I appreciate that very much, and I want to emphasize for our audience, we have interviewed a lot of spies and a lot of detectives, actually, and Gene is almost unique to us in our experience in both the depth of his criminal investigations background and the combination of doing that and also working with the covert operations scene, which I think gives you a special perspective on both sides of these issues. So, Gene, we want to go over some of the cases that you've had personal contact with as we wrestle with the problem of criminal activity within the intelligence community or peripheral to the intelligence community. And you feel free to analyze that for us, if you can, help us understand how it goes on and why it's so hard to stop. You worked on the Jim Sabo case, for example, a Marine Corps colonel who died here in California not too long ago. Tell us a little about that.
Yes, I did. Colonel Jimmy Sabo was the number 3 man at the Marine Corps Air Station at El Toro in Orange County. In January of 1991, the first week of the Gulf War, he was found shot to death in his backyard, and the Naval Investigative Service and the Marine Corps wrote it off as a suicide. The family contacted me and asked me to assist in that investigation. I've worked on that for about 4 years, 3.5 years. We established scientifically and forensically that Colonel Sabo was murdered, and it was staged to look like a suicide. And I was called back to Washington, D.C. by the Commandant of the Marine Corps to brief his staff in 1993 on the case, which I did. We put together a solid case with some of the world's top experts that he was murdered, including the top respiratory physiologist in the world, who's the head of the department at UCLA Medical School. We presented this to a federal court in Santa Ana, California, and the covert operators with their connections in the Justice Department sent a man out to California to monitor the case and to shut down the civil suit that we filed in order to try to force a criminal case in the federal courts.
Right. And why, simply, why were they trying to shut that down?
The covert operators were using contracts with the Marine Corps to haul weaponry and money around the world through a series of front companies flying military C-130 aircraft that had been stolen out of military channels, and they were flying weaponry to the Gulf War, and Colonel Sabo was going to expose this.
No drugs involved, as far as you know, in that?
Their drugs were involved with the aircraft, not necessarily with the Marine Corps Air Station at El Toro, but this whole network flies illegal stolen weapons out of U.S. military stockpiles to revolutionary groups and civil wars all over the world, and they sell them to our friends as well as our enemies. And they have a covert operation going on as we speak, and a secret war going on down in Peru, which overlaps between revolution, narcotics, and the smuggling of narcotics into the states, and the laundering of huge amounts, billions of dollars of drug money involved in this. And Colonel Sabo was on the periphery of that. He was the chief of operations on the base, so he knew about the covert aircraft that he was told to keep his nose out of their business, and he was pretty straight arrow, and he said he wasn't going to have anything to do with it.
Right.
Had a clash, and the next day he was dead.
In his backyard on base?
Yes.
Right. Well, there's a great case to start with, because we have discussed many cases over the course of this series, and the dilemma is, why is the government backing up this kind of thing, and what do we do when good officers that are serving the country and other people, a lot of innocent people, get hurt here? So if you can help us understand, somebody rationalizes this and says that this is okay. Did the base commander say, make it look like a suicide, or we just won't have a regular criminal investigation, or how did that work?
Well, the general in charge of the base, Tom Adams, was forced into retirement in disgrace over this case. So was his number 2 man, a colonel by the name of Joe Underwood, who happened to also be the next-door neighbor of Colonel Sabo. They sent a team, the Inspector General of the Marine Corps, out here to California to try to shut down the case. And they sent the executive assistant to the Attorney General of the United States out in charge of shutting it down, and he passed himself off as a Marine Corps colonel out of Headquarters Marine Corps, when in fact he was a member of the U.S. Justice Department.
Right. Well, this is the dilemma that we're all struggling with, is how do you solve problems like this if the federal government, for whatever reason, comes in and deliberately tries to subvert the truth. Now, I want to touch on a number of other cases, so we may get back to this, but I want to make sure that we cover others. Vince Foster's death is mysterious also, and you were consulted to comment on that. Can you lay us out just the essence of why that looks like a murder rather than a suicide?
Well, I was called back to Washington by some national TV investigative journalism producers to look into the case when it started becoming bizarre. And I walked the crime scene, I talked to witnesses, I reviewed the entire case file, and I am a homicide investigator and have been for 40 years. And in a nutshell, the only thing I can tell you is there was no evidence of suicide. All of the evidence points toward murder, but if you don't conduct a proper homicide investigation, that evidence is lost. They got the Park Service to go in and investigate that, and the Park Service is really just crowd control and traffic police. They know nothing about homicide investigations. They claim that they run about 35 death investigations a year, but it's really derelicts and drug dealers that they find dead in the park.
There are some real anomalies in that case. Can you focus on those quickly? Well,
the first thing is the alleged suicide note that he supposedly wrote. Vince Foster never wrote a suicide note. His office in the White House was searched. His briefcase was searched in the White House. Nothing was found in it, and several days later, a torn-up piece of paper in 27 pieces was found in his briefcase that they alleged was a suicide note. There was no effort made to collect fingerprints off of that 27 pieces of paper, and paper is the easiest thing in the world to get fingerprints off of. So whoever tore it up, if there was no fingerprints on it, had to have been wearing gloves.
Right. Plus there was a gun in his hand and other anomalies about the crime scene.
Well, the whole crime scene was a farce. The weapon was a typical assassination or hit weapon used by organized crime. It was made up of parts of 2 different weapons that were 50 years old that could never be traced. His fingerprints weren't found on the weapon. He was laying out just like you would see somebody in a morgue with his hands at his sides and the weapon grasped in his hand with his thumb through the trigger guard. The crime scene, nothing about it made any sense.
And you've had a lot of experience with homicide investigations.
I've investigated violent deaths, probably 1,000, 1,500 of them.
Right. Well, those are the details, and there are many more for those who want to dig into it, but now I want to ask you, what does it mean why would somebody kill Vincent Foster, an attorney in the White House?
Well, that wasn't what I was looking into. My question was, why didn't they run a proper investigation?
Why cover it up? Okay.
And why the park police were allowed to run a homicide investigation on a government reservation, which Fort Marcy Park was, instead of bringing the FBI in, particularly when the man was the president's legal counsel.
Right.
And his closest friend since they were children.
Well, please, shed some light on that.
Well, it doesn't make any sense. Obviously, there's something major that they wanted to cover up by not properly investigating his death. You can speculate. As an investigator, I tend to not speculate too much, but all of the major covert operations going on in Arkansas, down in Mena, Arkansas, they were laundering money through ADFA, the Arkansas Development Agency that is part of the Whitewater scandal. Vince Foster was part of that. The Mena operation itself was so bizarre, and it's still going on. It was created in the early 80s under the covert operators under George Bush when he was vice president, and Bill Clinton was the governor of Arkansas. And part of the deal was that if Bill Clinton would go along with covering this thing up, they would use the influence they had to assure that he would be the Democratic nominee for president. It is a very, very convoluted thing that crosses over party lines. There are airplanes at Mena, Arkansas today, and I was only there about 18 months ago checking on it again with the local police and the state police, flying weapons all over the world. Part of these stolen C-130s that Jimmy Sabo was going to expose flew out of Mena, Arkansas. You've got covert operators that have their finger in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party who blackmail or influence people on both sides. So the Republicans are afraid to expose what was going on in Arkansas extensively because they created it, or the covert operators created it under their watch.
I want to emphasize that dynamic just for our audience because, and you can elaborate on it, most Americans first haven't even heard of Mena, so they've got to have connections in the media also. We've heard lots and lots about Whitewater, but very little about Mena. But as far as I can tell, there's excellent evidence that there was gun running, there was money drops to the Arkansas political establishment back in the early, mid-'80s, isn't it?
Absolutely. I started
Right.
investigating Mena, Arkansas in 1987.
So it's been there for almost 10 years.
Yes.
But it has barely been touched at all by the major media, while they've spent enormous amounts of time on some less important things. So they get a finger in both political parties, and they've obviously got some influence over the media and the Justice Department if they're sending Justice Department people out to suppress criminal investigations. That was the implication of something else that you said in Sable's case.
There are attorneys within the intelligence community, in the Pentagon and the CIA, who have been what they refer to as sheep-dipped. They have them resign from their service, but maintain a reserve affiliation either with the Pentagon or a backdoor connection to the agency as an attorney, and then they, through political connections, move them into the Justice Department.
Would the former Attorney General, I think William Barr was his name?
He was a CIA officer,
right.
Yes.
Would he be that kind of an example of that kind of a person?
He would be one that is more obvious. The Assistant Attorney General of the United States who came out to California to shut down the Sabo investigation was a reserve Marine Corps colonel that they recruited years ago and had him get out and get into the Justice Department so they could network covert operations inside the justice system of the United States.
It'd be a lot harder to know that he had a CIA connection.
They're damage control people that can shut down investigations that get too close to the covert operators.
Right. And all this is to do what? To protect arms shipments or to make money? Or
Well, it's a little more complex than that. This goes back into the mid-'70s when they had the major scandals involving CIA officer Ed Wilson when George Bush was CIA director and General Vernon Walters was his deputy and Ted Shackley was the DDO, the Deputy Director for Operations. They had a major scandal of Ed Wilson training Colonel Gaddafi's terrorists in Libya with U.S. Special Forces, NCOs.
Right.
And he shipped 40,000 pounds of C4 explosives over there on a DC-8 out of Houston, Texas. And when it started becoming public knowledge, and it only started after September of '76, after the assassination of Orlando Letelier, the Chilean diplomat in exile in Washington, D.C. After that, it started becoming public knowledge, and Bob Woodward started writing some articles in the Washington Post. And so they decided to cut their ties with Ed Wilson and make him go down the tubes as a Lone Ranger, having moved all of this military equipment and people, massive amounts on covert airplanes to Libya. And as a result of that, the scandal grew so big that in 1977 there was an event called the Halloween Massacre between October and December '77, where CIA Director Stansfield Turner saw that the covert operators were totally out of control, and
fired about 800.
Fired over 800 of them, forced them either to resign, retire, or be prosecuted. And Ted Shackley and Tom Clines and General Secord and former Assistant Secretary of Defense
all these
Frank
folks whose
Carlucci,
names we've heard from Iran-Contra.
They were all caught up in the scandal and had to quit. And they felt that they were the true secret police patriots of the world, and that Ted Shackley had planned on becoming the next Director of Central Intelligence after Bush if Jerry Ford won the election. And they felt that they had been betrayed by their country, so they decided that the country and the Constitution and the Congress was their enemy.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, we're going to get back to the macro scale. I want to point out that some of these folks go back a long way, like Ted Shackley, you mentioned. He was involved in Southeast Asia during Vietnam, right?
Yes.
And some of them go back as far as the OSS, I guess, Richard Helms and Bill Colby.
Right, and Bill Casey.
Right. Well, you also investigated the Gander air crash, which some people may not have heard of, but 248 American servicemen died in a crash in Canada. Could you, in just a minute or two, give us the sense of how this relates to Iran-Contra, which we have heard of?
The covert operators that I was running with, I was recruited into Ollie North's network in 1985, and the covert operators I was running with had several contract airlines that they established, spin-offs of Air America, the CIA airline that came out of Southeast Asia. One of the airlines was Aero Air, a contract airline at Miami Airport, owned by a guy named George Batchelor, an old aviation spook. Secord, Ollie North, Bill Casey, that whole crowd, Shackley, used Aero Air as a contract airline to haul weapons all over the world, and to justify it without anybody looking at it. It was, they used the cover of hauling troops from the Sinai to the United States as part of the Camp David peacekeeping accords.
But that's very illegal to haul explosives and troops at the same time in the same aircraft.
It's a major felony. It's a violation of military law, federal law, FAA rules, the ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization. It violates all those rules to haul hot cargo on a passenger airplane. And they got 248 soldiers and 8 crew members killed as a result of that.
Gene, we were getting into the Enterprise. What is that, and is it gone? And how'd you get involved in it?
The Enterprise is different than what they referred to in the Iran-Contra affair, and it is still as strong as ever. In the late 1970s, I was Director of Security on a program in Iraq, a CIA program called the IBEX program, and the front company running it was Rockwell Corporation. I got drawn in as Director of Security after the assassinations of the 3 managers of the program in 1976. That's where I met Dick Secord. General Secord was the Chief of the Air Force Section. Albert Hakim was the bagman on the IBEX program. Ed Wilson had an office in Tehran at that time. After I evacuated my family out of Iran during the revolution, I couldn't go back there because I'd been a police and counterterrorism advisor to the Shah's government. I started I got some contracts with the Saudi royal family to do counterterrorism and train a security force for the royal family, and brought my son to Riyadh to help work on that program. And then I started stumbling across Dick Secord again over there. They had taken the IBEX program after the revolution in Iran and simply renamed it the Saudi AWACS program and moved it across the Gulf. And this was a big money machine, so they could get kickbacks off of these programs for covert operations. In the mid-1980s, 1985, now I was running with all of the old covert operators that I met while I was on the IBEX program. I was recruited into Ollie North Secord's enterprise, if you want to call it that, in 1985. They wanted me because I'm a Farsi linguist and because of my counterterrorism work in the Middle East. They wanted me to set up a death squad to go after what they would identify as terrorists in the Middle East. They wanted me to set up a program to move weaponry to Afghanistan through Pakistan. At that time, I was vice president of an airline. I had 23 cargo airplanes, and they wanted those.
And they were looking for cargo capacity, big time.
Yes, they wanted them for the Afghan program and for the Contras.
Right.
And I was taken by CIA people to the State Department, up on the Hill, to the offices of Congressman Bill McCollum of Florida, and introduced to Rob Owen, Ollie North's outside man of the Contras, and to Vaughn Forrest. And I became a trusted insider with these people, but over a period of time, you don't learn this stuff in one day, but over a period of years, it evolved that these guys had taken over the government. After Shackley and Kleins and Carlucci and Secord and all those guys were fired from the government, they decided that since the government was their enemy, they better infiltrate it and take it over. So what they did was simply stated that we're trained to install generals and dictators and people under the control of the covert operators in governments in Central and South America and Southeast Asia and the Philippines. They said, why don't we use our expertise around the world to focus in on the United States and treat the United States like the world's biggest banana republic and take it over? And they used those exact words, treat the United States like the world's biggest banana republic and take it over. And the first thing they had to do was get covert operator George Bush, former CIA director, in the White House. So between 1979 and 81, they started funneling shoeboxes full of money into congressmen's campaign coffers. If they wouldn't accept the money, they got them compromised with women on sex. Sex, bribery, and threats of assassination are the key tools of the covert operators. They call it their tradecraft.
Don't lose your train of thought. I want to interrupt briefly because, you know, I can imagine people in our audience don't know going, this is too much. They took over our government. And yet I want to reaffirm what you're saying. You're telling us things that you saw. And I want to ask just one detailed question, and then you get back on describing the course of events. We talked to Jim Rothstein, whom you know, a retired New York City detective, about compromise operations in particular. And he was talking about the use of children, not just adult women, to compromise politicians, but the use and abuse of children. Did you ever encounter any of that in your experience?
I did on the edges of it. I would love to name the man, but there is a very prominent man in Washington, D.C., very prominent, who was on the board of directors of some of Ed Wilson's front companies, was a personal friend of his and George Bush's, who used to furnish page boys to dirty old senators to do sexual favors.
Well, let's not go down that road because we have covered it, and it's quite a distraction from the main point, which is the arrogation of secret power to the point where they can actually talk about taking over the government and continue running drugs and guns around the world, even though we've all had Iran-Contra hearings. Did that stop all this or not?
That never even put a dent in it. In fact, it let it run freer after that because everybody stopped looking. And in a way, the Iran-Contra hearings, which were a major cover-up, were a favor to these guys because the American public and the media and the Congress were burnt out on the hearings in Iran-Contra, and they assumed they went away after that. They didn't even slow down. They're going heavier now than they were then, yes. And they're moving. They're selling weapons to our enemies as well as our friends and moving huge amounts, billions of dollars worth of money around the world. They have attorneys with front companies who are investing this money in high-tech industry in the United States. They're buying into the media, to the umbrella corporations that own the national media, into the aerospace and defense industry and the telecommunications industry, through frontmen, not so they have majority ownership, but so that they have enough ownership of stock in these corporations that they are a single block of stock owners who can place people on the board of directors of these corporations. These guys have bribed and blackmailed so many congressmen that all of these congressmen that you see and senators who are no longer running for election, most of them are burnt out because they have been blackmailed and threatened for so many years that they either have to continue to compromise their integrity for the rest of their lives or leave U.S. government service.
And that's a very serious proposition because theoretically the Congress is overseeing all this. Let me add just this point. We had some very intimate conversations with Senator Dave Durenberger in Minnesota when he was the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Oversight Committee. And I think we're going to do a second program with you to talk about the deep structure of how the political process gets paralyzed. We've only got about 30 seconds left for today. You sat in on a meeting involving these folks that had to do with militia topics, and could you just characterize that briefly and we'll go on with that?
Yes, in the mid-'80s I was listening to the covert operators in Washington, D.C. talk about how jealous they were of the KGB having domestic police and secret police powers in the Soviet Union, and they wanted those powers in America. And they decided one way to get that was to create or infiltrate patriotic militia movements in America and cause disruption and controversy and clash between ethnic groups and racial groups in the United States so that we would give up some of our constitutional rights and they could take over.
Well, thank you for today, Gene, and we're just going to do a second tape with you because these topics are too important and too complicated to be dealt with in just 28 minutes. So thank you all for tuning in to Rethinking the World, and we'll see you again soon, I hope.
Ground Zero Minnesota is an all-volunteer education nonprofit dedicated to informed democracy and human survival. We organized in 1982 to deal with nuclear weapons issues, but have always supported education about human rights, the environment, corruption in governments, and other topics pertaining to war, peace, and human survival. We cannot guarantee the accuracy of opinions expressed by anyone on this series, but we screen them as carefully as we can and have concluded that their stories deserve a public hearing. For more information about our videos or other efforts to address the developing global crisis,